Cat, it's Maximus here, this time with a basic review and comparison of feeler gauges. I'd actually picked up this Harbor Freight set right here, and I'll include the part number for it, and I had a few other sets, and so I was going to just do a review and comparison of these, but I thought it'd be better off just to do as a general one. I have some of the more common ones here, a few different Napa KD models, a couple different Craftsman models, a nice Starrett, and then an older cast iron. Really just to show that they're basically all the same unless you really step up into the nice ones like the Starretts, and they do set themselves apart. Not as far as the accuracy or what the feeler gauges do, but small things as far as the build quality are concerned. As far as the Harbor Freights are, I should also mention that you always want to keep these well oiled. It's the first thing I'm going to mention here because these are made out of hardened steel. And it is not stainless steel because they need to be extra hard. And no grade of stainless steel can get as hard as steels that do rust. High carbon steels is the easiest way of putting it. And feeler gauges need to be very hard because they're used in a variety of situations, very commonly on automotive, motorcycles, machine maintenance, and they can be used in a variety of other situations because they are just essentially, if we can get this to focus here, just pieces of sheet metal that have been very precisely manufactured to 1/100th of a millimeter or 1,000th of an inch would be what they're specified in, but as far as their tolerances, they would be 10 times greater than that because these, you really need to trust them. So if you're, say, working on some valves on an engine, you might select the 4/1000th feeler gauge. You would swing it out. Now this Harbor Freight one's really poor. The gauges are okay, but we can see that the laser etching is just a bit inconsistent, but we can see a fine grinding or texture on the gauges, some of the gauges, which, you know, is kind of interesting. Seems like the thicker ones go through a slightly different manufacturing process than the thinner ones, because we can see how much shinier the thinner ones are. But anyway, you just take a gauge, you would fold it out like so, and then you might put this under the valves of an older Honda engine that, you know, you have to manually adjust, and then you'd put this under the valve, and then you'd adjust a little screw down until it has a little bit of tension on it, and then you'd do the lock nut. And in a situation like that, you wouldn't want a soft piece of metal because it could potentially dent it in or smush it a little bit, and that would give you an inaccurate reading. These are used in all sorts of mechanics. Say you're checking a gearbox and you need to measure lash. You just pull out various fingers until you get one that has a nice snug fit into whatever groove or crevice that you're trying to measure. Maybe there's some kind of situation like this, and you just find the appropriate size until it starts to fit in there. Like we can even see that this cover, being plastic, is still smaller than 4/1000th of an inch. Pretty tight fit. Which should also be one of the alternative uses of feeler gauges. Since they are high strength, they can be easy to tear if they do dent and fold, and so they're inevitably tools that you would want to have a more of a, you know, beater set, and then you might want to have a real nice Starrett set or something just for real precision measurements, because it's inevitable that these things will get damaged. Also, they really like to rust pretty quickly, so, you know, sometimes they do end up rusting. You just don't get enough oil on them, and that's just kind of the nature of these things. That's why they're not particularly expensive. But many plastic items like this, remote control, don't have screws. They're all held in with internally molded snaps, and many times you can get a little screwdriver or even a little feeler gauge in between the crevice, and you can stuff it in there and then start carefully running it back and forth, kind of like replacing a cell phone screen, and it will help release those snaps. So it's one of the tricks. You can also use that plastic packaging to do the same thing. So anyway, we talked about these Harbor Freights. They are interesting. It is a real complete set. It goes all the way from, and they have some interesting ones. They have a 35,000. They are, I don't know exactly why they're structured like this, but they have the thickest ones on the very top. I think it's the most common sizes, and then like the rest of the pattern is all the way down here, which is, you know, it's fair enough. They also have one 10,000th brass one that is also duplicated in steel. I'm not sure at this point what the brass is really used for the 10,000ths. But that'd be a situation where you wouldn't want the hardened steel because you're worried about causing some sort of damage. So at least they do give you a brass one. You don't really see that very often, say in these Craftsmans here. These Craftsmans, or one of the few that have a small set of brass feeler gauges, so you may want to look for that. And we can see corrosion here. It's just really difficult. You really need to keep these things super well oiled. So the first deficiency of the Harbor Freight is that little nut and bolt setup. Any halfway decent brand will have a little thumb screw, so you can loosen it up. It's real easy to swing out the size that you need, get it at the angle, and then you can actually tighten down the thumb screw, and it really does help hold it in place so the thing isn't swinging back and forth when you're trying to use it. So that's the first mark of anything of a decent quality. That's why the Harbor Freight ones for $4 are kind of throwaway. Otherwise, it's just the same standard set. This does have a few more sizes than the Harbor Freight, particularly because it has that brass section, but it's still just a bent piece of U metal with a better thumb screw. And they're all pretty much like that. You know, we have another Craftsman set, which is just the steel ones. We've got an old school cast iron. So this cast iron uses like bronze rivets. And even though this is a nice one and it actually has some longer fingers, I also really like these older ones where the size, since you know that they're in thousands, cast iron just did the simple thing, and I think it's really smart, is they just printed really big numbers. The only thing they could have done better was actually had a number this way, like closer to the end, and then another number this way, where it's just super easy to read. So really wish they still would have done that. This set has definitely been well used. We can see this one down here, the 6000s. Obviously was probably using a lot of V8 engines. So this is kind of how they look after you really use them, and really demonstrates why they need to be this hardened steel. This is definitely was used to adjust many valves. We can just see all the little scallops. But if you do take care of them, they'll still at least hold up. But of course the issue is these rivets have gotten a little bit loose. You have to spend a little bit of time pounding them tight again. So these things don't really work that well in practice. We have double L's. How these work is they're even and odd. So one size is like, 7 and 9 and 11 thousandths, and this side is going to be 10, 12, and 14 thousandths. They're also angled just so you can get into tighter valve trains and other situations where that may be necessary. So I do recommend having a set like this. And then, of course, the big deal as well about these is they give you super extended reach, just massive reach. So really handy in those types of situations. They, of course, have the same thing. This is just a small, like most common thin sizes of the angled ones. They do indeed make little, this is also a KD. I'll include all the part numbers of these. This is just a really, see, they did it right there where they had them crossways and you can read them pretty easily. But this is just a super tiny feeler gauge set just for real tight spaces. I always thought this was neat. Really hard to find those tight ones. Of course, they do. This is just a one-off that I found, a 27 thousandths. We can read that. But this is a 12-inch feeler gauge, so of course you can order super long ones if you need to. And I don't have any Mitutoyos. There's actually quite a few, machinist measuring tool manufacturers that make feeler gauges that are really nice. This is my Starrett. I actually lost a little thumb screw thing, so I'll have to find another one someday. But the Starretts are always really nice just because of the consistency of the steel. They're always just super premium, although they use really small printing, which has always kind of frustrated me about the Starretts. As you can see, I have kept these very well oiled. But that's the mark of quality. Like the Harbor Freight was just a little bit odd how the thinner ones were shiny and the thicker ones were coarse. Really a quality set. They're all going to look exactly the same. And of course, what would set a more premium brand apart is this, where instead of all these, where it's just a bent over piece of sheet metal, the Starrett is actually two independent stamped pieces of steel, and then they actually have this little solid block right there as the spacer on one end. So it's not much of a difference, particularly with feeler gauges, but when I ran into these were used, I just thought, oh wow, that's a nice touch. Going through the effort of putting in a whole separate block of metal really is trying to set your product apart. Anyway, that's the end of my overly excessive 10-minute long video about feeler gauges, but just gives you an idea of the different styles, what would set apart a cheaper set from a more expensive set, and some of the situations you'd use them in. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and commenting and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.